Chapter 2, New Empires in the Americas. Section 2, Europeans reach the Americas. Okay, so we're going to start with the old familiar story of Christopher Columbus and sailing across the Atlantic to get to the Americas. Now, Christopher Columbus was a sailor from an Italian city-state known as Genoa. And, of course, trade to Asia was not unusual, so he had heard of the great wealth you could possibly get from going to Asia. And Columbus wanted to find a trade route. As we've talked about in the previous section, countries are starting to look for alternate trade routes to get to Asia besides traveling through the Mediterranean. So Christopher Columbus was looking for someone to help pay for his expedition to get to Asia. Now, his plan was to sail westward across the Atlantic. He figured that you just sail right over to the west, you'll hit Asia. So he was asking around, and lots of people turned him down until he went to Spain, and he persuaded the king and queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, to pay for his expedition across the Atlantic. He promised them all the wealth. He promised them you'll have, new lands to claim, and they were willing to bite. So Columbus gets his money, and we'll start planning for the expedition. So Columbus set sail on August 3rd, 1492. And he leaves Spain with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he sails across the ocean. Now, after a couple months on the ocean and not seeing any land, the members of Columbus's crew were getting a little anxious, to be exact, and they were ready to kill Columbus and throw him overboard and turn around and go back home. And just as a planned mutiny was about to begin, lo and behold, they find land. So on October 12th, 1492, Columbus reached the Americas. Now, with that being said, Columbus believed he had gotten to Asia. Now, Columbus and his crew will land on an island just off the coast of what we now know as the United States, in a country we know as the Bahamas. He landed on one of the islands of the Bahamas called San Salvador. Still around today. If you look at this map right here, San Salvador is right here in the Bahamas. Anyway, he met the native people there, and he called them Indians, because he thought he landed in some place called the East Indies. Now, the East Indies is part of Asia. It's those islands down kind of southeast of like China. That's called the East Indies. Anyway, so he calls them Indians, thinking he's in Asia. Columbus wasn't really interested in the native people that lived on San Salvador. All he really cared about was gaining the wealth, and he was interested in finding gold and other fine riches that he could take back to Spain. So if you follow the path of this map, the blue line on this map indicates the first voyage that Christopher Columbus went on. So if you follow, he left Spain, kind of traveled along here, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That's a long journey. People were getting really angry, and then he, of course, lands at San Salvador. And then they kind of explore like what we now call Cuba and Hispaniola, which is this little island here, so on and so forth, and then travels back to Spain. His second voyage was the Red Line, kind of the same idea, and he kind of explored a few more islands that he hadn't gotten to before, and then goes back to Spain. The third voyage is in green. You kind of see it again. This time he hits a little bit of what we now know as South America. Kind of comes back. And finally, the fourth voyage is the yellow line. He does a little bit more exploring. This time he goes into what we now know as Central America and parts of Mexico, and then sails back to Spain. So he does 4 voyages. On one of his voyages, his last voyage, because he was kind of made governor of some of the lands that were claimed, he wasn't a very good governor. And he was kind of kicked out or removed from being governor and sent back to Spain in handcuffs. That's how bad of a governor he was. Anyway, The impact of Columbus's voyages on the world will not be realized until many years after his death. He doesn't even realize how much of an impact he had. In fact, he probably still believed, I have to believe by the end of his time in the New World and headed back to Spain, he realized that maybe he wasn't in Asia. But for a long time, he still believed he was in Asia. Columbus's voyage will change the way Europeans thought of the world and their place in it. I mean, for the longest time, it was Europe and Asia, and then Africa was added to that. And now there's a whole nother continent or two on the other side of the world, which was never known. You know, at least Africa and Asia are right next to each other. But the Americas were not known at all. And so that kind of just changed the whole way of thinking in Europe. So it began a new era of interaction between the Americas out here and Europe over here. So a lot of interaction between the two. Well, we know that the Portuguese were the leaders in exploration for a while. But when Spain went over and found the Americas, essentially, that changed everything. And Spain will now become really the leader of exploration. In 1493, a Spanish pope named Alexander VI, will come up with this idea of a line of demarcation. The line of demarcation basically cut the Atlantic Ocean in two parts. And anything on the right-hand side of this line would be Portuguese land, and anything on the left-hand side of the line would be Spanish land. Now let's look at this line. It's the dotted line here. This is the line of demarcation, this one right here. Now if we look at that carefully, there's not a lot of land for the Portuguese. You got this little bitty part right here. You got some islands out here. But essentially that's it. Everything over here, Spain. Later on, a treaty will be developed between the Spanish and the Portuguese, which will move the line about 800 miles further west, giving the Portuguese a little bit more land. So this solid line here is the Treaty of Tordesillas line. Still, Spain, Portugal over here. Today, most of Latin America, or South America, I should say, over here, is Spanish, with the exception of Brazil, which is this part of the continent right here. That is Portuguese, which makes sense. It stems all the way back to this line of demarcation and the Treaty of Tordesillas. We're now going to talk about some other explorers that came to the Americas after Christopher Columbus. And we're going to start with a guy named Amerigo Vespucci. This is him right here, Amerigo. The continents of America were named after Amerigo Vespucci, who kind of sailed to South America and kind of explored the kind of northeastern coastline of South America. This was in 1501. Oh, Amerigo. This guy is Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Balboa is going to be the first European to set eyes on the Pacific Ocean, and he's going to do this by crossing this thin piece of land right here, known as the Isthmus of Panama. Now today, this is the country of Panama right here, and it's very narrow right in this area. It only takes a few hours to cross it. However, it is a little, there's a lot of obstacles. There's mountains and a lot of trees and such. It's not a straight shot across this piece of land, but it's not that far. Anyway, Balboa lands on the Caribbean side of the isthmus, crosses it, and is the first European to see this large ocean over here known as the Pacific. Next, we have a guy named Ferdinand Magellan. And he is going to he's going to lead an expedition, which will be the first expedition to circumnavigate the world. Anyone know what circumnavigate means? I'll give you 3 seconds. Do, 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 do. Circumnavigate means to go around the world or completely circle the world. So let's follow Magellan's path. This was in 1519. Magellan leaves from Spain, and he leaves with 5 ships. He heads down to the tip of South America. Prior to that, he lost one of his ships over here somewhere. He gets to the tip. This is a horrible part of the world right here. The ocean's very rocky, rough waters, and he loses a second ship right over in this area right here. But he does manage to sail across the Pacific Ocean. And now, because it's a flat map, we have to go to the other side. So it goes here, then over here. And he lands in the area called the Philippines. And while in the Philippines, he's killed. Magellan and his crew end up in the middle of like a civil war, if you will, in the Philippines, and Magellan is killed. And again, another ship is destroyed there. And so they will eventually, with the crew, some of the crew still alive, they will leave the Philippines, and they will eventually make it back to Spain. They've completely sailed around the world. The first crew. Magellan didn't make it all the way around, but his expedition will be the first to do so. By the time he gets back to, or the expedition gets back to Spain, Magellan's crew only had 18 members left on the one ship. Out of 237 sailors, only 18 survived the entire expedition. One ship, 18 men. We're not going to talk about the Columbian Exchange. It's called this because of Christopher Columbus. He was the so-called discoverer of the Americas, and thus trade will start beginning. So explorers are going to bring with them plants, animals, and diseases to the New World, meaning the Americas, and they will bring back to Europe plants and animals they've never seen before to the Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this is the Columbian Exchange, this trade. Now, it seems kind of weird that you would trade diseases. Well, not purposely you are trading diseases. That just was totally accident. Of course, Europeans would have immunities to some diseases and not realize that they were carrying any kind of disease with them, and they go to the Americas where they come in contact with the Native Americans who don't have those immunities built up, and the Native Americans would get sick and then die. Millions of Native Americans died due to their contact with the Europeans. Explorers brought horses, cattle, and pigs and grains to the Americas, and in return they took home things like corn, tomatoes, tobacco, and cocoa. That's the end of section 2.